Hello and welcome back to the reading of Treason by Burleigh Doherty, published by Anderson Press. I hope you're enjoying it so far. Okay, this chapter is called London. "Please don't go," my sister Marjorie shouted the next morning. She was following me down the track from our house with mud on her skirt and her hair loose and tousled over her shoulders. "Don't leave me here alone." "I have plans for you too, mademoiselle," my aunt said, striding after her. She dug her bony fingers into Marjorie's shoulders. "Put your coif back on, and come inside at once." I looked back, just once. I saw Marjorie being hauled into the house by my aunt and Nurse Joan clucking and flapping behind her. I saw Ned turn away from us, his cap in his hand, and trudge to the stables. I saw the old crumbling walls of my home, and beyond it the sea, stretching blue and deep and far, far away into the line where it became shimmering sky. And then I turned back and kicked my pony into a trot till I caught up with father. "Why do I have to go to London?" I asked him. He shook his head. "You keep asking me that, and I've told you. Lord Carew asked me to bring you to see him. That's all I know." "But why? What does he want?" I asked anxiously. "He's my employer. He doesn't give me reasons." "That's what it's like at court." "I have no idea what plans he has for you, but have I got to stay?" "I don't know. Probably." He retreated into his silence, and I gazed around me, too miserable to enjoy the ride with him. The thought of leaving my home and Marjorie behind was unbearable. He'd never has separated before. We were closer than ever these days. I still didn't know what had happened to Brother John. Perhaps I would never see him again. And as we left the last glimpse of the sea behind, I thought of Matthew, still lost somewhere under the waves. I felt as if I was abandoning him now forever. We rode on through green rolling hills covered in trees. The birds sang different songs now, I noticed. I had left the gulls and the curlews behind. "Is it like this in London?" I asked. "Green and trees everywhere?" Father gave a short laugh. "Not at all. You'll find it interesting, William. It's an adventure for you. Think of it that way." "Do you like it, Father?" "No," he said shortly. "I can't say I do, but that's not the point. I have an important job, and that matters to me." "I wish we didn't have to do things like Aunt Carew tells us to do," I muttered, but if Father heard me, he didn't say anything. I had no idea then that the nearer you got to the king and his court, the less you could call your life your own. "Father, do you know where Brother John is?" He shook his head. "My sister tells me she has provided for him. I think he will be tutoring in another house somewhere." I heard the trail of doubt in his voice, and knew that he was only guessing. "He didn't even say goodbye to me. He wouldn't leave without saying goodbye." "Then perhaps he has only gone away for a few days. He'll be back soon, and Marjorie will tell him where you've gone." "If he does come back, I'll write to him," I said, in Latin. We spent that night at the house of my father's closest friend, Lord de Crecy, although his lordship wasn't there. He was at the King's Palace in Greenwich, where he was a councillor. "He is a very dear friend," my father told me. "If anything ever happens to me, you should go to him for help." "Why should anything happen to you?" I asked, puzzled and suddenly afraid. "What kind of thing?" But father refused to say anything else. I slept badly, aching from spending so long in the saddle and in the cold, fresh air, and fretting over everything. I was quite glad to be setting off again next morning. We spent a few more nights in manor houses on the way, and people always asked father what it was like to attend court and what he thought of the king. "I don't see much of him," he said. "I'm not a courtier, after all. I'm in the service of one." He never wanted people to think he was important, and that he attended one of the highest courtiers of all, and had his own study in the palace of Westminster. "But you do see His Majesty sometimes?" he was asked by the lady of one of the houses. She looked as if she would eat him, she was so keen to hear his news. "Oh, yes, he's a splendid king, magnificent." "But he has a fierce temper, doesn't he? We've heard. Everybody's afraid of him." And father just nodded. "He has a few favourites." "Favourites?" I asked, joining in. "What does that mean?" My father frowned. "He takes a liking to people sometimes and embarrasses them with fine presents. He's very generous." "And then he chops their heads off," the lady sniggered. "So I hear," my father said, rising abruptly from his chair. He bowed politely to the lady and went to his room. And that was all he would say. Even though I asked him to tell me more about King Henry, he would just say things like, "He's a fine tennis player," or "His banquets are wonderful." He would never talk about the king himself, which was a great disappointment to me. For most of the time we trotted along in silence. I went over Latin verbs in my head. I knew some of the poetry that Brother John had taught me by heart, and it was a kind of comfort to think them to myself. I could hear his warm, kind voice and imagine his bright-eyed smile and his chuckle of delight when he was pleased with me. And I had his rosary snug in my pocket. Where was he? "I have no sight, nor hands, many ribs, a mouth in the middle," I said aloud, remembering one of his riddles. "I move on one foot. I am swift as the wind. What am I?" Disappointingly, my father said nothing. "How far now?" I asked him, after nearly a week of riding. My poor old pony was as tired as I was. "Very soon," father said. "Listen." He halted his horse, and so did I, and we heard London on the wind. We heard the mad ding-dong of hundreds of church bells, and the thunder of carriage wheels, and the sound of distant shouting. We climbed a hill and looked down, and the din of the city rose up to us, hammering, bleating, chiming, babbling. "Is it always as noisy as this?" I asked. "Oh, yes. Sometimes when you're in the middle of it all you can't hear your own voice, but at night the city sleeps. Then it's quiet." I looked down at the spires and turrets and the crown of buildings with black smoke hanging over the roofs, the twisting river bustling with boats and the swarm of people like maggots on a carcass, and my stomach churned with misery. "Oh, let's go back now," I begged, and even as I said it I heard Matthew's voice in my head. "Onward, ever onward." So I followed father down the slope, and soon we came to hovels and sheds where people were selling all kinds of things: wooden spoons and strings of onions, dried herbs and cooking pots, grubby bits of clothing. Ragged children ran up to us, tugging at the reins of the horses and the hems of our clothes. Dirty hands stretched up, pleading for money, for food, for anything. Now I could smell London too. It was the smell of sweat and dirt and rot. We rode on in the dark, cramped alleys of leaning houses. Smoke and cooking fumes billowed round us, choking us with a stink of hot grease and damp wood. I felt stifled, as if the air had been snatched away from me. "I don't like it," I said. "Father, I can't stay here. I can't breathe. Can I go home soon?" I looked round, panicking. I wouldn't be able to run in the fields or fish by the stream or let my pony gallop into the wind. I would never hear the sea. "Please don't make me stay here. Can we go home now?" "You're not a child any more," my father said, and that was all. "You are to meet the king today." My father lodged just inside the city walls, at the top of a tall thatched house with tiny latticed windows. It looked out onto a large yard, but the sounds of hundreds of horses trotting by on the cobbled road beyond kept me awake till well after dark and woke me again at first light, along with the church bells and the cries of the watchmen shouting the hour. I didn't want to know what time it was. I wanted to sleep and to wake up at home again. I had a headache from the stench of dung and other foul smells rising from the streets. I felt sick and miserable, and I couldn't touch any of the cold meats and cheeses that had been laid out for me by the good wife of the house. My father made me kneel and say our morning prayers with him, and it was comforting because it reminded me of the time before Matthew died, when we always prayed together in our little chapel. Matthew used to pull faces at me behind his splayed fingers, and I would be squirming with hidden giggles. But as soon as the good wife knocked at the door and said that Lord Carew and another gentleman were below, I began to feel nervous again. I could hear someone snorting like a horse as they climbed the narrow stairs. I'd never met my uncle before, and I was surprised to see how thin he was, and grey, not at all plump and colourful like my aunt. He was all of a quiver, with dry, crackling hands that he stroked together all the time, one palm flat against the other as if there were always an unseen speck of dust to be wiped away. His eyes were sharp and bright as a bird's, and he flicked his head from side to side, noticing everything in the room and not liking any of it. He had brought another man with him, a tailor, whose face was pitted with smallpox scars. He had a basket of heavy fancy clothes with him, and he darted round me, sizing me up, with his hands and his eyes, and then sorted through the basket and brought out an embroidered doublet of green velvet. "This should fit you well, young sir," he said to me, "and it's a good colour. His Majesty is very fond of green." His Majesty. I swung round to look at my father, but the tailor tutted and pulled me back so that he could lace the sleeves on. The doublet was heavy on me and had long slashes in the sleeves, so my linen shirt gleamed through them as I moved. Over that he fitted on an even fancier jerkin with puffed sleeves. Then came the baggy upper hose, which was pleated and panelled round my knees, and last of all my nether hose. What a time it took to dress me! I had never worn such a fancy doublet and hose in my life. I wondered what Marjorie would have thought of me in them. Well, she would have giggled, I know that much. At last, after much snorting and sweating, the tailor had finished lacing me up. At my uncle's command, I turned awkwardly to be admired. "A little stitch or two on the shoulder, and he'll be perfect." The tailor clapped his hands as if I'd just done one of Aunt Carewe's dances for him. "What do you think, my lord?" "He looks well enough in them." "Thank you, Uncle Carew." I bowed my head slightly as Aunt Carew had taught me. "Make sure you earn them. These clothes have cost me as much as your father's salary for the year." My father bowed and thanked him. I flushed. I was hot enough already, and now I was embarrassed too. "How will I earn them?" I asked my uncle. "By pleasing the king." I stared round at my father again. He looked as tense as I felt. "Yes," he said. Your uncle has just told me that you are to meet the king today." "I've mentioned you to his Majesty," my uncle said, wiping his palms together. "In fact, I have made him a gift of a leather quiver in order that I may present you to him. He has accepted my gift. Now it is up to you. If he speaks to you, think first before you answer. Put your hat on. Ah, yes, I like the feather. Your hair looks good cut that way. It's the same colour as King Henry's. He'll like that. I've heard the king's as bald as an egg now under that floppy hat of his," the tailor muttered, pins like hedgehog bristles between his teeth as he altered the doublet to fit me, but he said it too low for my uncle to hear him. Uncle Carew was talking softly to my father, but when the tailor had finished with me and I was dressed up in all the rich clothes again, he walked round and round me as if I was a maypole, murmuring instructions to me. "Hat off. Bow, boy. Lower, lower. Now nose toward your knee. Up, straight. Remember to remain standing in His Majesty's presence. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Uncle Carew." "What is my proper address? Again?" "Yes, my lord." "If I were the king?" I took off my hat and bowed, my nose squashed against my knee. When I came up again, my head was spinning. "Yes, your Majesty." At last he and the tailor left us alone. I was more nervous than ever by then, fidgety as a mouse in a bed of straw. My head fizzed with questions, but my father seemed as anxious as I was, and couldn't answer any of them. "It's just an idea of your Aunt Carew's," he kept saying. He twisted his ring, rubbing the engraved seal on it as if it was a good luck charm. "Remember, Lord Carew has no family of his own, no son to present to the king. Families are very powerful here. If he can get you a situation in court, it would be very important for him." "What kind of situation?" "I'm not sure," my father frowned. "Lord Carew hasn't told me. You'll find out, if you get it." While we were waiting for time to go down to the river and take a wherry along the Thames to the Palace of Westminster, my father talked to me in Latin in case the king wanted to hear me. I answered mechanically. And when he switched to Greek and then to French, I followed without even thinking about it. But I couldn't concentrate on lessons that morning. Who would have done when they were about to meet the king? I was distracted by a rumbling in the yard below, and went to the little casement window and pushed it open. Beyond the yard, people were gathering on a bald bit of common land, all shouting lustily. They were pushing and jostling with no manners or care for each other, as if something exciting was going to happen. Some dogs were brought through, bright-eyed and dribbling, snapping at each other, closely held by 4 men. Then a gate near the yard opened and a large flop-bellied bear loped out, with 2 men hanging onto the chain around its neck. They fastened the chain to a ring on a post, and the bear looked about curiously at the crowd, as if he was hoping someone would step out and give him some breakfast. "There's going to be a baiting," my father said. "I'm afraid they often hold them here. Why don't you watch, William? It will help pass the time." "He's blad's up," a woman in the crowd shouted. "You'll see some sport now." A great shout went up as a bear suddenly lunged at one of the men, scoring his face with stripes of blood. The man screamed, people yelled, but the bear couldn't get near enough to attack the man again because of its chain. The 4 dogs strained on their leashes, snarling and yelping, cowering with their ears flattened in fright, their teeth grinning and wet. The huge bear dropped down onto all fours, watching them, backing off as they came grizzling towards him. "Go for them! Go for them!" my father shouted. "I don't want to watch," I said. "It's horrible." He looked down at me. "Oh yes, it's horrible, all right," he said. "But you get used to it. I want him to rise up like a man, not cower like a beast, don't you?" But I was frightened of the bear, even from up at the top of the house. When we were little, Marjorie and I used to pretend that there were bears in our garden, but I had never actually seen one before. I hated the way the dogs taunted him like that, making him roll and sway on the great black paws. I hated the screams and the roars and the yells of the people and the animals. I hated London with its sweating crowds, its foul air and its noisy streets. With all my heart I longed to be back home again with my sister, riding in the long grass around our ancient manor house. I closed my eyes, willing myself there, and it was as if I could smell the yellow gorse and the meadow flowers and hear the skylark spilling its song. I remembered right back to the time when my mother was still alive, when Marjorie and I were both little and Matthew would have been out riding or hunting with my father. Marjorie was hiding from me and my mother was sitting sewing on the grass, laughing at my frustration because I couldn't find my sister and shaking her head when I asked her to give me a clue. "Marjorie, Marjorie, where can you be?" I shouted, stamping my foot in annoyance. It was a game we played over and over again like a rhyming nursery song. She always found somewhere different to hide. She answered at long last. "I'm hiding under the willow tree." "Marjorie, Marjorie, why are you there?" "I'm scared of the dragon," she would say. "I'm scared of the bear," I finished, and she crawled out of the hiding place and laughed up at me. My mother hugged us both then and said there was nothing for us to be afraid of in our lives, nothing at all. A year later my mother died. She had been to stay with some friends and some visitors from London had arrived and brought the city's sweating sickness with them. My mother never even came home again. I was 5, Marjorie was 6, and Matthew was 8. I can remember the house of grief we lived in then, and how my father cried and how frightened I was. The roars of the crowd grew louder, and suddenly I was back in the awful present. The great bear lunged at another man, and suddenly there was a spill of crimson blood on the earth. My father tensed beside me and shouted, "Kill him! Set the dogs on him!" I didn't know my father then. I didn't understand why he wanted the bear to die. The dogs were unleashed with a great snarling and whining and the people yelling at them like a rising storm. I couldn't help watching now. Surely the bear would rally and give us a good fight. "Fight! Fight back!" I shouted, and my father laughed and put his hand across my shoulder. It felt good then to be with him again, to be watching this together. Now, I felt sorry for the bear. I didn't want to see him die, but I didn't want to leave my father's side. I could see a boy and a girl squirming their way to the front, just common ragged children, a brother and sister laughing together, and I thought of Marjorie again. I wanted her to be with us too. I turned my face up to my father, and he looked down at me. "Whatever it is that Lord Carew is asking of you, do it, William. Do it for my sake." And I felt a warm rush like a river inside me because my father had asked me to do something for him. I wanted him to be as proud of me as he was of Matthew. I would do it, whatever it was. "I will, Father," I said. "I promise." The Golden Sun of His Majesty. When it was time, we had to walk down a slippery catwalk over the mud to the wherry. The river was grey and moody, bustling with criss-crossing boats piled with fruit and fish. As we moved forward to step onto the wherry, I froze in terror. We were to float on that water, that grey, churning, restless water, and though my sense told me it was only a river, my terrified mind told me it was the sea, and that at any moment huge waves would rear their heads like monsters from the deep and drag me down the way they had dragged Matthew and me down. I tried to turn away, but there was no going back, and no staying there. I was pushed from behind. I was being shouted at by the wherryman. I had to step into the boat and cling on to the sides with my knuckle bones white and bulging and my eyes shut tight. Flies danced over our heads and the smell of salt was stinging and strong. I wanted to be sick. When we reached Westminster steps, I was the first off the boat, and then I remembered why we had come and was low with nerves again. I looked up at my father, but he just nodded to me and to go on, and my knees nearly gave way with fright. I floated rather than walked up the steps, away from the river, and into the great hall of Westminster Palace. I had never been in such a huge, noisy, colourful place before. There was a roar of sound as we went in, a terrible echoing din that made me want to cover my ears. Hundreds of voices spiralled round, laughter and gossip, high chattering of children, music from trumpets and tabors, and the whining and yapping of dogs. Crowds of courtiers strolled around in their bright satins and velvets, nodding their fine feathered hats at each other. The ladies wore gowns of the colours of apples and raspberries, lavender and mint, forget-me-nots and dog roses. Everyone smelled of the spiced pomanders they carried. Servants in green livery held up branches of candles, and the golden light danced and flickered on the wood-panelled walls. I gazed round and up, and noticed that painted angels with folded wings were carved into the vaulted ceiling. I felt calmer when I looked up at them. Maybe my guardian angel was among them, protecting me. I pulled my rosary beads out of my purse and touched the little crucifix to my lips for luck. "What are you doing?" "Not saying your prayers to the rosary. The king doesn't allow it," my father gasped, closing his hand quickly over mine. I scrunched the beads into my fist and tried to cram them back into the purse on my belt, but his fingers worked into my palm and took the traitor beads away from me. My hands were shaking and I felt sick and dizzy with fear. "I'll run out and throw it in the river," he whispered, bending down to me so his breath was hot in my ear. But before he could move away, there was a sudden deafening blaring of trumpets and beating of drums. My father clutched my shoulder. Everyone fell silent and turned to look to the far end of the hall. In walked His Majesty King Henry VIII of England. Like all the men, I took off my hat and bowed. All the ladies dropped deep, low curtsies and rose like the waves in a wind-swept meadow of flowers. King Henry stood for a moment to let us all gaze on his glory. His jewels flashed in the candlelight. His golden clothes shimmered as if they were made of the sun. He was the tallest man in the room, the biggest, proudest, fiercest man in Europe. And I was there, standing in his court. My Uncle Carew sidled up to us through the crowds of the courtiers, nodded at my father, and then pecked his face towards me. "Come on, boy. Follow me. Do as you're told. Look pleased to be here." I clutched my father's arm in panic. It was too soon, much too soon, but my father loosened my grip and patted me on the shoulder. I put on the simper that my aunt had taught me and followed Lord Carew through the crowd to the front dais, right up to where King Henry was now sitting on a massive carved golden chair. I felt as if my legs had lost their bones, and my shoes were filled with pads of wool instead of feet. My stomach was quaking with fright. I had no idea what was expected of me, but at least I had been taught courtly manners by my aunt. I knew how to bow and ingratiate myself, how to look interested, how to say clever things to make people smile. Lord Carew bowed deeply, and I did the same. "Your Majesty, allow me to introduce my nephew, William Carew," my uncle said. I gasped. "But I'm not a Carew. I'm William Montague," I wanted to say, but I did not dare. My tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth, my lips were dry, my uncle cleared his throat. "He is lately of Montague Hall, Your Majesty," he added. The king nodded. He studied me closely, and I felt myself sweating with embarrassment. Then he smiled. "A fine-looking boy," he said. Come closer, William Carew. I believe your golden red hair is the same colour as my own." He laughed with a deep, pleasant chuckle, and all the people round him laughed too. I bowed very deeply so that I could have a little think about this. What would Aunt Carew have expected me to say? When I came up again, I said, "The golden sun of His Majesty touches the lowest of his subjects and causes them to glow in his presence." He liked that. He loved to be flattered. Everyone knew that. He put his head to one side and beamed at me so his fat cheeks bulged and his sparkling eyes disappeared into his head like currants in a pudding. I felt a warm glow of pleasure and stopped trembling at last. My Uncle Carew patted his hands together in silent applause. 4 other boys were led up by their fathers to meet the king. They were all high-born nobles like my uncle, Lord Peter Carew. One of the boys was introduced as Lord Percy Howard. He came from one of the most powerful families in the country. Even I knew that. He was older than me and very sure of himself. He already had a pale fluff of hair on his chin, reminding me of a newly hatched duckling. He was tall and thin-faced, with a swaggering walk and an unpleasantly curling lip. He had heard what I said to the king and sneered at me, but I didn't care. I was dizzy with pride. When he came up from his bow of introduction, he sleeked aside his own lank hair, which was the colour of candle wax, and made a long speech to the king in perfect Latin. It was a little too fast for me to understand, and even the king frowned slightly as he tried to catch it. Then His Majesty clapped his hands together. Aha! Tu regere imperio populus Romane momento. Virgil, my favourite poet. You are a scholar, young Howard. Who will translate? I gave him a bright smile and opened my mouth to speak, but Lord Percy chimed in immediately with, You, Roman, remember to rule the peoples with your power. What a gabble he made of it too. A turkey-cock would have made a better speech. I could have quoted a beautiful Virgil poem to the king's glory, and I would have said it slower and meaningfully too. I glanced at my uncle, wondering whether I should recite it as it should be done, but he shook his head, his lips pursed, his eyes glinting. It was too late. I had lost my chance. One of the other boys piped up in Greek, and Percy turned to the boy, finished his speech up for him, and bowed. Flop, the waxy strands fell across his face. The thin fingers brushed them back, and flop they went again. The other boys bowed and spoke, smiled and stepped back as King Henry nodded curtly at them and flapped his hand as if he was shaking flies away. Then he sat back with his arms folded. He looked at me and looked at Percy Howard, and I realised then that there was some kind of a context, that the competitors had been narrowed down and that it was now between the 2 of us. Lord Percy's face had turned white. Whatever it was that we were there for, I realised he hadn't expected any competition. He drew in his breath sharply and slid a cold glance at me, and because His Majesty had smiled at me, I suddenly wanted to win. Whatever the job was, I wanted it to be mine. I have a yen for music, King Henry said. Can either of you young men catch the tune for me? He began to sing in a full, pleasant voice, and the ladies around him smiled and made their long gowns sway. A lutenist, sitting with the musicians, quietly plucked a few notes and then picked up the tune, and with a flourish, the king stopped singing and held out his hand towards us. I had never heard the tune before, but some starling inside me picked it up and sang it in my head, note for note, and some nightingale filled my throat with sweetness, and I sang words that I hardly understood in praise of His Majesty, the King of England.